think the topic for today at least does not really need any introduction. It is literally sort of the flavor of the last few months, even not, I would say, the flavor of the day. I think the world has been talking a lot about large language models, but what we wanted to focus on, and that's the topic that at least we have heard come up quite constantly in our conversations with founders, is as you think of integrating large language models in your own products, right? At least what are good maybe lessons to keep in mind, do's and don'ts on, I would say, several aspects, and we'll look to touch upon those as part of the discussion on, for example, what are good problems to pick and what are maybe not good problems to pick, right? How do you choose what's the right model for you? How do you get your teams upskilled? Because this is not necessarily something that they have known in the past. But before that, quick introduction to Vijay and Vara for everyone. So Vara is, a co-founder at Whatfix. I think they are a company that we have been lucky to have been part of the journey for a very long time. I think they have created a category from India, which is a bit of a rarity, still going very strong. And one of the things that Whatfix has done, I would say, in a very focused fashion in the past few months, is actually figuring out where all can LLMs be leveraged in different parts of their product. Vijay is a partner at Clear Ventures. They're an early stage investment firm based in the Valley. Prior to Clear Ventures, Vijay also used to be a partner at Intel Capital. And I think Vijay has been investing in AI long before I think it became fashionable. I think he's been investing in AI for close to a decade. So the idea is also to be able to pick Vijay's brains on what may be different with LLMs and what may not be very different with LLMs. With that, and first question for you, Vara, which is just an overview of Whatfix's journey with large language models. Where in the product are we leveraging LLMs? What have at least we found to be useful and not so very useful areas when you think of LLMs in an existing product? Would be very useful to start with.
Sure, Arpit. Though you're asking me about large language models, typically large language models are mostly talks about text. But I'll reframe that question to be more as deep learning. So where are we applying neural networks, deep learning? And I'll answer from that lens. So in general, I'll explain a little bit about Whatfix so that you have a context. When I take some of the use cases, you will understand what I'm talking about. So think of Whatfix as a layer on top of software, providing enough guidance, not just to the users. So the overall objective is that as users are using any software, can we help them to be more productive? Can we nudge them at the right places? Can we provide enough support and everything at the right locations as they are using the software applications? So we are a kind of a layer on any software applications. That's how the Whatfix works. So the place where we started up, AI as a practice we always applied, but to more specifically talk about deep learning, the place where we started applying was to detect different elements in a screen. So we used deep learning to detect. So this was around, I would say, around 1.5 years back, where we started this this area of work. So typically, computer vision is used for real-world object detection. For example, I'm sure all of us must be using Google Photos. So it detects people, and you can easily search by any person. Like I can quickly look I can select my photo and look for all the photos where I'm there. Right. So these are all happening through the vision models, where based on computer vision, it is detecting what is there in a photo. Same concept, we took it, but we tried to apply it on the computer screens. So the digital world, so the browsers, the applications that we go through, we tried to apply computer vision as a mechanism to detect different parts of the screen. Is there a button in the screen? Is there a text area in the screen? How do we detect different elements? Because for Whatfix system, we need to be able to understand these elements in the screen so that we can guide users on those elements. So that is our first attempt towards the deep learning, where can we use computer vision as a technique to detect different elements on the screen. That's where our journey with deep learning started. And after that, a lot of learning we learned, and as a R&D, we got more matured in terms of what deep learning can do. So from there, we started applying it in many different areas within Whatfix. So I can explain a lot of those examples, but in general, that's the starting point. After that, a lot of text-based LLMs we have started using. Then we are continuing to use a lot of vision-based models. So right now we are working towards a problem of can we create a model which can act like a human being and interact with applications directly. So let's say, for example, you want to book a flight ticket. Can you ask the model and can it automate? Can it take your browser control and do it for you? So this is a vision problem. So that's what we started. That's one of the problems that we are right now working on. So a lot of other places also we apply, such as many of the software doesn't have a lot of smart features when users start to work on the text in those applications. So given we are a layer on top of any software, we're trying to bring that intelligence onto every software application, where every text field and every text that people enter, you want to bring some of those smart abilities, such as can we recommend people on what to write? Can we auto-complete it for them? So things like that we are starting to bring those features.
Got it. And what if I was to just paraphrase what I at least heard was you're saying, when it comes to text-based and let's say a lot of natural language-based interactions, that is where we are leveraging LLMs. But for a lot of other applications, for example, the computer vision stuff that you talked about, it is not necessarily that we have found LLMs to be the most apt solution for those problems so far.
Yeah, almost accurate your understanding. Even for our vision problems, one of the thread we are also trying is, can we utilize text-based LLMs to solve a vision problem? That's also a thread that we are running. But also more importantly, we are also running another model, which is a more of a multi-model vision and text together can be run.
Got it. But I will come back to that in a minute. But I want to switch. I have a question for Vijay. And Vijay, this is, I would say that historically, and if I go back maybe 3-4 years when started seeing AI first companies for the first time, one of the challenges that I would hear quite often was that it is not very easy to get started with AI. Even if you are an AI native company, just building AI products was extremely hard. Data was sparse, models were not as capable, getting access to talent was hard. And then even if you built the product, convincing your customers to be able to adopt AI also used to be a bit of a challenge. Any point of view on, we have seen LLMs, and I think one of the reasons why they have become so popular is they seem to be easier to use. But any perspective on the complexity involved in building AI products, given that you can now leverage LLMs, has it gone up? Has it gone down? Or has it been a little bit of the same? That look, at the end of the day, while at an absolute level, LLMs allow you to start off at a better level, but relatively speaking, you still need to do as hard effort as you used to do earlier, let's say 5 years back.
It depends, right, Arpit? So if you take a few examples, right? So look at all those Gong-like tools, right? Where you have a call, it transcribes the call, segments it, and then it tells you what each salesperson is doing, right? There was a very serious engineering effort a few years ago, right? You had to sometimes use speech-to-text recognition, and then summarization, and then you had to write models. A lot of very nuanced models were required. Now with some of the large language models, it's pretty easy to recreate a lot of that stuff, right? It's pretty standard, and you can get a lot more accuracy with using large language models. So in many of the cases, especially if it's intelligent agent or if it's a chatbot, right? There's a cold start problem where you have to take customer data and then you have to figure it out. The POCs were long. So in those cases, using LLMs actually gives you a faster entry point into some enterprises, right? But in terms of security and in terms of access to your own data, that's still a challenge today, but pretty soon that'll go away as well, right? So I think LLMs do give you a head start in a lot of the applications.
Got it. And one follow-up question to that one, and actually that's for both you and Vara, which is, therefore, what are good use cases to pick to solve using LLMs, and maybe not so good use cases to pick to solve using LLMs?
Copilots are a really good use case, right? Because AI on its own hallucinates. LLMs on its own hallucinate. Sometimes they give out undeterministic answers. So having a human in the loop could be very helpful, right? So we're looking at human in the loop for accounting, for taxes, for finance. So that's a great use case. Or if it's consumer and it's not, if there's guardrails, you can use that as well, right? Things where I would say it's dangerous is when it comes to predictive capability, right? So for example, in computer vision, if I'm looking at a Foxconn plant and you're trying to detect issues with the iPhone, you don't want to have a LLM based application. So when you have predictive requirements, it's a great use case. Safety and security and compliance use cases, still LLMs are still not there yet. And even deep learning is not there yet in most cases. People tend to use rules-based approaches. That's one. Very low latency applications, LLMs are not there yet. They're pretty large. And so you can come up with lots of use cases where LLMs are good or not. Generally they're good, but it's not a solution to everything.
So generally the LLMs are the text-based LLMs are trained. Text or now GPT-4 is multimodal also. So the current LLMs are mostly trained on the public data, publicly crawlable information. Generally, the publicly crawlable information is more marketing-oriented information. So any application where you would have to generate content which is supposed to be user-facing, customer-facing, I feel LLMs can do it. The current LLMs can do a really good job. You really don't need to do much of prompting. You don't need to do much of training. It can really help you create some of, let's say, if you want to create if you have an application which is helping users to create blogs, so which you can, as it is, you can immediately pick and use it. But once you want the model to understand nuances of a particular company, so that is where it will get a little bit more complicated. For example, let's say you're building an application which is used by, let's say, insurance claim for an insurance claim process. Here, you want to guide a adjuster on what they can write as a comments and as part of claims. There's a lot of compliance in what you write in this. So the information that you write has to be very compliant. So you cannot directly use so the LLM which is already existing. So you'll have to either create some level of prompts or fine tune it. So that's what start adding a lot of complexity. So wherever the use case, I would say, which is and customer facing, marketing oriented, I feel very easy and straightforward APIs exist which we can utilize. Yeah, that's the other one which I will want to add to what Vijay has mentioned.
As you start building, I would say, sort of core AI capabilities for the first time in your organization, and we have heard, at least I've heard two different approaches. One is you start with a very small, sort of like a handpicked crack team, if you may, and tell them, guys, just think independently of everybody else, of what all AI can do. Right? The other is to say that, look, AI is so important that everybody in the organization, every product team or product pod that you may have, product plus engineering, of course, needs to be able to infuse AI into whatever they are doing. So guess what? Everybody needs to start developing these skill sets and these capabilities sort of from day one. Any sense on what's possibly a good approach towards this?
Yeah, Harpita, I'm in the second camp. Because what I had seen is that generally developers think, or even I used to think, it's a black box until you really start trying to understand it. It looks like a very black box, and it's something which is very complex. You'll have to learn statistics, probability, and so many things, and it just sounds very confusing. That's what typically a developer would see from when you're seeing it from far and trying to read Wikipedia. That's what it sounds like. But as a developer start trying it out, there's so many services that exist, and it is so easy to apply, and so many problems that they can easily directly solve it without really understanding too much about details of how these things are working. Of course, it is easy to learn also. It's not that hard. So I'm in that camp of getting this as another tool for every developer. So that is the camp that I'm in. So of course at Whatfix also, initially, it had to be a little bit of a push where we have to emphasize that everyone has to read about it, learn about it. And then we started running hackathons. So we asked every product team that in your product area, you have to come up with an idea if you want to be part of this hackathon. Not something very different, but you have to find every team, at least one. Our teams are like 5 people, 6 people size. Every team has come up with an idea. In one day, every team was able to come up with a solution. Of course, it's not production ready or anything, but it just gives them also a lot of confidence that you don't need to spend a lot of time. You don't need to spend a lot of effort for many low hanging fruits, a lot of things that are already existing, which we can quickly use. So that's what the camp, I mean, it's easy and every developer should use it as another tool which they can apply. Of course, there are certain problems which will be complex where you will need teams which are a little bit more specialized in that. But most of the things, every developer should be able to do it.
Vijay, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I'll come from a infrastructure slash company perspective, right? So when LLMs are new, CIO is, or the chief product officer, like I got to use LLMs to figure out what we can do. Otherwise, competition is going to beat us. So they start off with OpenAI or some of these canned tools, and then finally figure out, okay, fine, it's useful for X, Y, and Z. It doesn't solve everything. And then they start finding out, hey, maybe it's too expensive or it's too hard to do it. And then they start using open source tools. That's when they hire a few people, use open source tools. And there's going to be a bunch of startups which offer some kinds of tooling around LLMs, and they'll start using that. Eventually, all the cloud service providers will start providing these end-to-end tools, and then they go back into using standardized tools from Amazon, AWS, or so. So it's a trajectory, and that's when you'll see a lot of startups come up with, I can do X for LLM or Y for LLM.
But you're also saying that, I think, that this push has to first be initiated from the top. That
I think if you let people, a lot of people are trying to do it also, right? They're trying to make their work more productive, or the teams are trying it. But it's as I've seen with Samsung, it's dangerous to use open models. So I think there has to be, for example, a lot of the banks have stopped ChatGPT. So there has to be some corporate-wide initiative to say, hey, look, let's use LLMs. Otherwise, there's a lot of open doors.
We'll pick the next question, which is actually, I'm going to generalize that question from Kanik. And, you know, between Arpit, Shantan, and other colleagues at Solaris also, we must have met at least 50 startups, if not more, literally in the last couple of months, who are building an application on top of an LLM. And one of the questions that always comes up is that, and I think Vara, you and Vijay, you also pointed out, these tools have become so simple to use today that people can get started very, very quickly. If that is the case, where does the moat lie for SaaS companies? Either of you who would like to take a crack at it?
Yeah, I will take, and then Vijay, you add. So my view, the moat is in the data that your application, the data that you would own, the data which you will only own. So that's what I feel will be the moat. I feel models, more people will try, and it will become more and more open on many things how to be done. So I think the way that you create a model, they may not be a big differentiator in the future. And then everyone has access to the public data, so they will be able to access it. But still, I feel processing the public data, though the data exists, but you'll have to be able to crawl and process it in a particular way and still index it. That is still a high bar. So maybe I think right now you will still be able to have the moat of even use the public data, publicly accessible internet data, and train the model. You will still, maybe that is still a moat for a while, but eventually that will be the data that you possess, I feel, will be the moat.
Vijay, any different view on this?
No, I think in addition to the data, right, understanding the customer use cases and figuring out where LLMs can be used is going to be very interesting, because not a lot of places people understand where you can use LLMs to make the biggest difference. I think understanding use cases can be very helpful.
But maybe just to add to the question again, Vara, you are alluding to the fact that, look, data is the moat. and because everybody has access to LLMs. But for a minute, let's assume that LLMs is available to everyone, which it is. If you look at the engineering effort that you need to do on top of it, whether that might be in sort of embeddings, that might be in prompt engineering, and sometimes it may be in the post-processing. We are also meeting companies, let's say it's a chatbot. You do a lot of processing post the answer from the machine to figure out whether it is appropriate, not appropriate. So there is a bunch of engineering that you do around the LLMs as well. Is it fair to interpret your statement to say that, look, that engineering is unlikely to be a differentiator for companies?
Maybe in a short run, it is a differentiator, Alok, but eventually everyone will understand, everyone will be able to do that. So I don't think that engineering can be a differentiator. In my view, it will be the data. That is what will give the long-term moat.
Welcome, Bridge. Good to see you.
Hi, Bridge.
And thank you for coming on screen. So please go ahead with your question or comments or thoughts. So
Sure, absolutely. So just a quick one-line introduction. So for Vijay, I think we've never met. I run an early stage fund called Rewrite Partners. We invest typically at seed stage. Prior to that, I ran an accelerator called GSF. And Vara Whatfix was actually part of our accelerator program. And they graduated from that almost maybe a decade back, and then went on for bigger things. So we're also obviously looking to make investments in GenAI and LLM space. We've done 2 checks already. So the question I had, you made a really interesting point, Vijay, around co-pilots, right? And how co-pilots and with humans in the loop might be an interesting use case, especially when tightly coupled with customer use cases. What I wanted to sort of understand was, the way, like, let's say the big tech is implementing co-pilots might be very different from, let's say, how startups address certain use cases, right? And when you look at current auto agent type of use cases that are being put out there, they don't seem to be production ready. When you actually look under the hoods, they seem to be very brittle from an engineering standpoint for production use cases. And at the same time, there is a huge evolution happening at the larger LLM models level, right? So Anthropic coming up with a 100K context window and so forth, right? Where that changes the scenario in terms of how you build and create LLM models. So any sense on how the space is moving? What are you trying to look at? Like, let's say if you take one step below on what do you mean by co-pilots or humans in the loop, what are you guys looking at?
So maybe I'll give a few examples, right? We just invested in a company called Cinch. The CEO is Nigel Duffy, who is a PhD in AI, but he was the global head of Ernst & Young accounting practice. So Ernst & Young has been trying to use AI for a long time, and accountants, it's a very manual process, right? Yeah. So we just invested. He's building call it a accounting GPT, kind of a large language model, encoding all the rules, and so that's a good co-pilot because now accountants have to verify. They don't have to do a lot of the manual stuff. Same thing for RPA. We invest in a company where you can, humans have to verify more or less, and it takes the time out of that. One more company is a company called Lilt, which is machine translation. Automatic translation can get to like 90% accuracy or 85%, but the SLA for enterprises is like 95 plus. So they're co-pilot for translators to make their life better. So we are looking at a lot of co-pilots, like almost every industry where you could use a co-pilot. We're trying to both in, I think what I mentioned, foundation models, we're looking at speech and even vision and artistic things as well, which is really hard to do for co-pilot.
Great. That's quite interesting. Thanks. That was
Vijay, just to follow up, as we think of building co-pilots, right? Given the example that you had about Cinch, where this guy Nigel used to be EY head of global accounting practice. Is one way of thinking about a co-pilot is that, look, while the LLMs will do a lot of, I would say, user experience oriented work for you, it is a fair degree of knowledge engineering that an expert brings into the table to really make sure that, and I'm not talking knowledge engineering from a heuristics or a rules perspective, actually, providing the learning that the domain needs to the co-pilot that comes in from that side of the world. And you marry that in with the capabilities of an LLM so that the end user experience is actually very seamless.
Yeah, so I think there's three inputs, right? One is the codification of the rules and that itself, the heuristics. And then there is the LLM, which is the language. And then there is the human input, which is kind of the, how do you capture the human input to understand that, right? So I think those three things together, I mean, it's not accurate, but it saves the time a lot. So the next question becomes, just a co-pilot might not be enough to become a $10 billion company. So we might even think of rolling up accounting firms. So you go offer it. So there's some business model innovation needed as well. But I think that the interesting part with LLMs is when we look at investments, we don't see the software budget for these different, like what is the software budget for accounting? Very little, right? So we see the human budget of how to augment humans. And how do we look at the market spaces for that?
Got it.
Vijay, sorry, I have one more question there, which is that in some ways, it also feels like that there is a race between the generalized models or general models versus these fine-tuned or specialized models for specific domains. And you could argue that with passage of time, some of the capabilities that the specialized models are doing, as long as that data is public somewhere and not proprietary, then that data could actually come into LLMs tomorrow as well. And the edge that these fine-tuned models or specialized models may have may actually begin to diminish or at some point possibly even evaporate. Would you agree, disagree with that statement? And how are you sort of baking that into your investment thesis?
So I think, as Vara said, right, if the data is publicly available, generally the larger the model, the more accurate it is, right? I mean, we can talk about costs and all that stuff because it's very expensive, and maybe a fine-tuned model is cheaper and better. But most of that investments we are doing is not public data. It's some enterprise data. So taking a large model and fine-tuning, and again, if you look at every day's paper, right, there's Quora and there's a new fine-tuning quantization model. Models are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. You can take 100 billion parameter model and now you can run it. So that part of the, I'm not worried about compute costs. You can run some on iPhone right these days. And that's going to be a battle where people are going to make it smaller and smaller.
I think there is this question on open source models. They seem to be catching up really fast, right? And so broadly, do we think current closed models such as the ones by OpenAI, right, will they be able to retain a head start, or will people build increasingly more on top of open source? And if at all, how will people choose, I think, between open source versus closed models?
I have a controversial view. I think closed models is kind of it's not sustainable, right? If you look at Google, Amazon, this is a battle for not dominance but survival in many cases, right? So they're investing heavily in building these large models for the core business. So you can't compete with cloud. They have data, they have compute. So if they decide to give a model away, then that's it. So I think we'll see a lot of open source models. And back in 2014, 2015, building a specialized model was different. Now everybody uses a BERT. You don't care if it's some proprietary BERT or something, right? It's just a commodity model. I think models, more and more people will start using open source models for production.
Yeah, almost like now, if you look at a green phase, there are tens of thousands of open source models that are available, which are pre-trained for many different purposes. So almost think of a use case, you may have some pre-trained model which you could utilize from there. But I still feel some of these larger companies, let's say like Google, it's not just the public data that they have, but they also have lots of proprietary data, which they could actually train their model with. So some of that knowledge, it's hard to get from any other open source model. So I do feel some of the cloud vendors will still have their own specialization where their models will act pretty good compared to open source. But open source, I do feel will continue to grow for more specialized use cases.
Whatever it is worth, yesterday we had a session of a lot of our portfolio companies where some of them presented what they're doing with LLMs. And while Vijay, what you're saying is likely right, and we also read a lot of blogs about it, saying that ultimately it's the open source models. But one of the conclusions, at least from yesterday in that session, was that OpenAI API still is actually far ahead of everybody else in terms of its output. What some of them are also doing is that it's not a one-shot task that you just pass a prompt and get the answer. Since many people are also chaining it, so sometimes you're using open source for the initial part of the chain, and then for the final output, you might end up using an OpenAI, at least for the current. And of course, we don't know how that's going to evolve over the next 6 months to a year. But
yeah, I think my thing is like looking forward, right? So today GPT-4 for sure is more accurate, right? Tomorrow Google might come out Palm 5 or something, and then just open source that. And now you need GPT-5 or GPT-6 to go. So that race, I think the open source will win that race. That's just my pet peeve.
Can I bring in Nitin Chaudhary next? By the way, Nitin is a very dear friend for a very long time. I'll pick his question. Are there any successful examples today in performance marketing using LLMs? For example, conversion of prospects to insurance buyers or credit card users, etc. So any good use cases we have seen to either of you?
I've not particularly seen that, sir.
Yeah, so definitely, I think for producing some of the marketing copies and are producing the mailers or producing any of that creative content, we've seen lot being used. But beyond that, I don't recall.
So I'll give maybe one more example, right? Within the marketing thing, like logo creation is a very hard process, right? It's an artistic process. There are companies which like coming out of CMU where you try to give different prompts to get different artistic impressions. So now you're not designing a logo, you're doing prompts for a logo, right? And same thing, we started working with OpenAI like 3 years ago for our own in-house. So when we write a response to some of the customers, it's automatically LLM generated, right? So that's a very low-hanging use case, and I think expect a lot of marketing LLM companies.
Maybe I'll try and combine. I think both questions are very similar from Siddharth and Vishal, which is in production use cases of LLMs, how does one implement guardrails or observability? I think Vishal had a similar question, which was more specifically on the subject of co-pilots. How is it advisable to use them without checks, or how do you apply checks and balances here?
Yeah, so what I'll add is that Vijay was meant, the copilot means it is not automatic, system is not automatically doing. So there's a user in between. User is actually correcting, or user is taking some action on it before they finally use the output. So you will be able to observe for sure how much of that as it is being used by the user, or user is modifying further. So that will give a good amount of understanding of the quality or performance of the model. So which you can use it to iterate over a period of time to improve its quality. But beyond that, of course, if you're a company which is targeted towards enterprises, then enterprises have a lot of data security requirements, such as you may not want to have one particular enterprise information by mistake being showed to another enterprise. So you will have to take a lot of precautions in terms of how do you put the boundaries between every enterprise data. So there are, of course, around data and data security, a lot of precautions has to be taken.
Yeah, also maybe I'll give an example, right? So let's say you have an LLM and it's throwing profanity. So you can take the output of that and then use a profanity model to correct it, right? So you can use a combination of techniques, but it's a pretty interesting area. I think it's a pretty, that's one area we're spending a lot of time on. How do you get trust and explainability and get past the chief compliance officer or chief risk officer?
And maybe just to add to it, yesterday again, I'll not name the company, but one of our portfolio companies, they initially had a human in the loop to put those guardrails. So, and it's actually a classical large enterprise application what they're building for. And well, fortunately, they have grown so rapidly now in the last 3 months that human in the loop is actually, so they had sort of like a back office where once the requirement from the customer came, they were not giving it real time, but they were basically populating the backend and the customers could use it. But it is scaling at such a rapid pace that just doesn't suffice any longer. So that human guardrail was not working. And so Vijay, what you're saying is exactly what they had to do, which is that the output of the LLM is actually what's now going through a different model to be able to check whether this is appropriate for human consumption or not appropriate for human consumption. I would argue that if you also look at a lot of chatbot applications, they also are actually asking very similar questions. It's easy to build a version today, but what if the model hallucinates? It can actually throw up a lot of garbage too. And therefore, the post-processing to make it performant is also sort of emerging as a large area of engineering in many
And also
companies.
like access control, like, hey, what can this person see? Ask questions. There is no like prompt gate which says everybody can ask the same question. It has to be rules based. It has to be dependent on so many things. I think that infrastructure is still not there. It's a pretty interesting area though.
I want to pick two questions in a particular order actually, which is why the first one is from Priyank, which is from an MLOps perspective. What do you guys think? Do we use, let's say, a set of point solutions, or do you centralize your tooling around, let's say, a particular provider, could be Azure, GCP, whoever?
I'll answer that and then I'll let Vijay. So if at all you're using, let's say, any point solution, let's say OpenAI or any of it, so it's still better that if you can route the calls through a common service of yours, so that eventually you have an ability to replace it and do something else there instead of that. That's what my recommendation. But obviously, given that you also may have your own data, which you will want to fine tune on all of that, and you may want to use an open source model and build on it. So you'll better to build a reusable service which all your teams can use, because not just one solution, but you will be able to use the same data for many different features in the product. So it is better to build it as a common reusable service in the product, so that more teams can use it, or you can use it for more features.
I'll probably give you a controversial answer. Use whatever you want today. Eventually, it'll go to the cloud, right? Try whatever you want to. In 2-3 years, it's going to be Azure, AWS, or this one, right? So because it's like SageMaker, right? You had 100 tools before SageMaker came in, and now SageMaker may be crappy in something else, but it's like, I don't know if people remember the hyperparameter tuning was a set of companies. There were so many tools for hyperparameter tuning, and then eventually it becomes a small feature in SageMaker. So I think eventually this will get consumed by larger cloud vendors. So it's just a matter of time. We can try different tools.
Got it. That actually was the second question, which also was there.
You know, a lot of people who are using LLMs today, they're also sort of beginning to think about the cost of using these models as well, right? And there are two sort of countervailing forces, which is, on one side, you're finding so many more use cases, and the volume of those individual use cases is also going up. I mean, Vara, in your case, if I may say that tomorrow, let's say, as you do autocomplete for some things, there might be lots of people who are sort of beginning to use it. And each of these ultimately, even for inference, if they're actually making a call, there is a cost to it. On the other hand, there is a point of view also saying that, look, the cost of using these models is reducing substantially, partly because of competition and partly just because of the volume effect as well. So do you believe that there is going to be any material impact on the gross margin of SaaS companies which are deploying LLM use cases?
Yeah, if you don't apply it beforehand thinking about cost, definitely there will be an impact. Because the cost is, for some of the features, is substantially high. And if you're using only for inference, it is still maybe okay. But let's say if you're fine-tuning it, and if you're fine-tuning it for every customer, then the cost actually multiplies very, very fast. So you have to be really cautious about the cost when you're picking a feature, for sure. So broadly, I think the parameters like accuracy, speed, cost, security. So all of those, you'll have to look at it while making a decision. So definitely cost is a big factor.
Yeah, so look at NVIDIA today, right? 200 billion market cap increase because of Gen AI. And so it's a race. I think there's going to be more compute, which is going to become more efficient. At the same time, models are going to become smaller. And like you said, some of these techniques like explainability, adding explainability LLMs increases the computational cost by pretty high, right? So there's always this balance of what will happen, and somehow it eventually balances out. So I don't know if the gross margins will change, but somehow it has a effect of balancing it out.
And on the other side of the margin equation, which is from a revenue perspective, any like if you're adding features which are now Gen AI driven into an existing product, how should one think about pricing those features?
So definitely for us, we think of this as a extra products or premium subscriptions and things like that. So definitely we could price these higher for the customers. And if these features has enough value, we'll be able to drive additional revenue through this. So definitely we could do that. But even if when you can drive the revenue, but still there is a limit how much a customer could pay. So that's why cost is still an important factor to look at it. Value versus how much you are charging, that's a factor to look at it. But these are the things in our view we could charge extra from the customers.
Typically with adding some of these LLM features, you're attracting a different audience, a non-expert audience, and also allows you to like some PLG kind of features, right? So maybe you don't charge for the feature, but you get to a much larger audience as a marketing funnel into your product.
Actually, that was one of my follow-up questions to Vara, so thanks for that. And I had a second one, which is if you take let's say we fast forward maybe 3 years out, right? Do we think a lot of, or there'll be a set of features which, while they are all incremental and additive today, will just become table stakes over a period of time? In the sense, let's say auto completion of emails as an example, right?
Yeah.
Today we might have the ability to charge a little bit more for it, but 2 years out, our customers are going to come back and say, you know, guys, what? We don't think we need to pay extra for this. This is just table stakes.
Likely, Arpit, all that can happen. That's why the subscriptions and the features will have to be a little bit fluid, as it's not just true for AI features, but it could be for any other feature that your product has. And some of those can become just the table stakes, which it will become a basic expectation. Then you need to be ready to move it to the most basic subscription. I agree with you. So at some stage, some of these features will become just the table stakes, which you will have to offer to every customer.
Maybe an example is if you look at, again, going back to computer vision, right? People detection, car detection, people used to pay for that.
Yeah.
Right. Now you don't need to pay for that. It's just commodity. But if you go to like a very specialized like cancer detection, you probably have to pay for it. So the level of intelligence and the specificity keeps increasing over time.
The question is from Sri Kumar Narayan on how important it is for vector databases to be on-prem. And I'm going to generalize that question a little bit, which is that particularly as you begin to work with enterprises, which is certainly true for you guys, Vara, and you are invoking APIs, let's say with OpenAPI or anybody else for that matter. If you are passing data in the prompt, which is proprietary to that enterprise, how sensitive are the enterprises to the privacy issues here or security issues here? And would love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. Hello. So given as an enterprise software vendor, you will sign data protection or data privacy agreements with the customers. So every data processor, whether it is OpenAI or Azure, so you have to make sure that it is abiding by the rules. So whatever is the customer's data expectations, that we need to make sure that through the chain we can guarantee it. Otherwise, we should not use any service which we don't have a good control on the data. We shouldn't be using those services. So it goes. The answer is same for whether it is a vector database or whether it is a LLM that we are triggering with a prompt or LLM query. All of these places we can be potentially passing some other sensitive data. So we need to be cautious on every data processor that we are using. It is important, but it's not mandatory that you will have to host everything on your own infrastructure, your own cloud infrastructure. Some of these service providers also give that guarantees around data, which you can vet the agreements very clearly, and you should be able to use it.
I want to take a question from Puneet and rephrase that maybe a little bit, which is the question is around industry-specific LLMs. Where do you see industry-specific LLMs coming up, and what kind of what could be moats that they could have in those scenarios?
Yeah. I think we can think of it like a general SaaS versus vertical SaaS, because the vertical SaaS has a very specific specialization for that vertical. The solutions are very precise to that particular industry. I feel it is exactly the same here also. Is it a very horizontal generalized LLM versus something which is vertical, which is very precise? For example, the example I was talking about, say the insurance compliance comments. So here the comments have to be very compliant. You cannot just write any comment there. So even if it's a simple note, it has to be very compliant. So you could build an LLM which is very precisely learned on the insurance related data. So then you will have that vertical specialization. So I do feel there is right now, I think we're mostly applying at horizontal use cases, but I do feel the future we will see more and more vertical pointed, very specific LLMs, which are solving that problem very properly.
Actually, I do have a follow-up question on that. And this came up in our session yesterday also. Given that we are talking about verticalization, that there are two schools of thought. One school of thought, which is saying that, look, for these specialized vertical use cases, but by the way, it may be functional also. It can be HR, it can be supply chain, it can be procurement and HR, etc. Is that you need to build fine-tuned models for these to be able to create more performant models. That's one school of thought. The other saying that, look, you're actually better off trying to do this via prompt engineering as opposed to building fine-tuned models. In practice, what is it that you're finding to be sort of more correct? Or is there a way to think about putting a framework to it saying that, look, these kinds of use cases do it through prompt engineering versus the others do it through fine-tuned model?
Yeah, the big difference between these two, prompt versus fine-tuned, is that every model has a context size. I mean, it can understand the context only up to certain characters. So if you are giving a prompt, at best you can give training data up to that size. And a lot of times that size may not be sufficient for you to give all the different examples. You may have so much more data, which you may not be able to just give it as a prompt because the context length is limited. So those are the cases when your knowledge is a lot, then you will have to fine tune it, or you'll have to pick good parts of that knowledge to prompt it. So, but more often when your vertical or use case specific knowledge, if it is pretty large, then you'll have to fine tune the model. Prompt may not be sufficient.
Yeah, I think it depends on the distribution of the data which is used for training of that large model, right? If you're using industry specific data, you'd rather fine tune it than give it as a prompt. So it depends on, do you want it personalized to your own enterprise data, or you can get away with the open source data out there?
I had a question, but that's my own question, which I do want to chime in with, which is, one of the things that at least again comes up is that the number of technical choices one needs to make, right? Or the nature of those choices actually is very fluid, in the sense that today you're trying one model, tomorrow you may decide, hey, there's a better model for us. Today we're using OpenAI's model, tomorrow an open source model may be doing better. We may be using an ensemble of models and so on. Now within that, I think what are actually choices that therefore you should be making with more care from a technical perspective, and choices where you're saying, what, this is not as important. These are okay. We should be able to sort of switch over. But there are certain choices which you make them today, and then it's very hard to undo those choices, let's say a couple of years down the line.
Generally, the data that you have and processing the data to a format where you can make it consumable to a model, that is a pretty hard thing to do, because you'll have to first collect the right data in the right way, and you'll have to store it, and you'll have to process it in an appropriate way. That is I feel is a lot of task. But I've also talked with some of the fellow companies where they talked about that it doesn't take more than a month for them to retrain an entire model with different variants, which I don't disagree with them. If you have a data in an appropriate way, I don't think it's so hard for you to try variants quickly. So my view, more focus on the data cleanly. What are you collecting? How are you collecting? How are you storing? How are you processing it? All that I feel is more important. And the model, we should be in a way that we should be able to test it out quickly and try more models and more variants more faster. So probably that is the way maybe I would think of building an architecture.
And Vara, one follow up on that, which is in our case, getting, let's say, our data architecture the way we wanted it right? As you described, where it is clean, it is coming in the right format, and then it can be used in whatever sort of way. How long did that take us?
Actually, it took a very long. As part of our computer vision, the model that we started around 1.5 year back, most of the time went with that because we had to iterate a lot. So data collection was not correct. Some things we were not capturing. So the training was not proper. So we had to redo that. We had to recapture appropriate data. So most of our effort, I would say, went in that same process, the data capturing and making sure that this data, right data is captured. That is what most of the effort. Training it and testing it, that was, I feel, smaller portion of the entire effort that we have done.
Understood. Got it. One very interesting question from Sri Kumar, which I just see on the screen. Has there been any experience to co-build with an anchor client? And potentially you may even have a revenue sharing agreement with those guys to start with. And if at all, what are good examples and how have they played out?
Yeah, so that's very common for us. Well, I mean, not just the AI, but any feature, we typically have a design part. We call them as design partners, essentially customers who are willing to, who are very excited about that feature and who want to take the pain of going through the journey from us. So we start working with them from the sketches. So there's nothing in the product. We're just showing them the drawings and things like that. From there, they work with us. So that's very common, and customers also very excited to do it. And I'm also seeing some of the agreements where customers are asking it, anything that you are building in UI around AI, I have to be a design partner and you have to give me a commitment in an agreement. So that level, some of the customers are asking now. So customers are very excited and they want to design partners. They want to co-innovate. So
that's very interesting.
Definitely approach. Yeah,
you're seeing a much more pull, I think, now as compared to earlier when there was a lot of push.
But I feel it was always there. Customers always want to innovate. They always want to be the first ones to try. So it's just that maybe we are not. We have to approach it. That's all. We have to ask them.
At this time, I think I'm going to add to the second part of Sri Kumar's question, which is, would you allow your customers to participate in the monetization, which is that you developed with someone else and now you give them a royalty as you sort of implement with other customers? And Sri, at least I can say in 10 years of selling, I encountered this so many times from large enterprises. And the more you stay off it, the better it is. You don't want to share your IP with a customer. You will just go nuts in just trying to manage that contract and establishing what is IP, what is not IP. As you evolve that solution further, what percentage of that IP is the original IP? It's just very hard to debate these things. Yes. It's a mess. You don't want to go there.
Yeah, the thing that you can try is that for that customer, you give 1 year for free, or you give 2 years for free. That's all okay, but nothing more than that.
Maybe we can take Prank's question as a last question. We have only a minute left, which is, does using AI give a new SaaS company a way to win over an existing large SaaS company? Any examples?
Examples are, I couldn't think of an example, but definitely I feel it SaaS. But Vijay, go ahead.
No, I think almost every company, right? Unless the main moat is a distribution or maybe it's the data. If you add AI to it or like Gen AI, there's a chance to disrupt it, right? I mean, there's not too many companies out there now, but like take Gong, for example. Most of the features of Gong can be built by a kid over a weekend these days. What it took them years and years to build freely for most people. You can take Marketo and then go after that. You can take, people are going after Adobe. And so right now, every company is open game for someone to go after that. Like Zendesk and ServiceNow, you can do a lot better job than what was done before. So yes, for us, it's easier. One investment model for us is go find the biggest startup of the last 10 years, which is doing really well, and then go and see if you can take a piece of that.
I think with that, we will close this. We always promise to start on time and end on time. But I do have one last shameless plug that I wanted to announce, which is we are looking to organize a hackathon around Gen AI on 10th and 11th of June. This will be actually at the Whatfix office in HSR. So at least people who are in Bangalore and would like to attend, please do come. There'll be some exciting prizes for folks who win in terms of credits. And there are more details on our LinkedIn and Twitter pages. With that, thank you so much.